It began innocently enough, the kind of thing neighbors brush off as a minor inconvenience. A dog barking late at night, annoying, but forgivable. At first, the neighborhood tolerated it. After all, everyone knows that pets have their restless nights, and one barking session doesn't make for a crisis. But with Karen, nothing was ever that simple. Her dog's barking wasn't occasional. It was constant, unrelenting, and it tore through the nights like an alarm clock nobody asked for. The first time the neighborhood noticed, it was a Tuesday around midnight. Most families had already settled into bed, exhausted from their daily grind. Yet Karen's German shepherd began howling at shadows, barking at every movement, and pacing the fence like a restless guard. The sound carried across the block, echoing between houses, rattling windows and jolting people out of their sleep. Neighbors closed their windows, shoved pillows over their ears, and hoped it would end. But it didn't. By the second week, everyone realized this wasn't a passing phase. The dog barked through midnight, into the early hours of the morning, and sometimes again at dawn. Parents with newborns found themselves at their wits' end. Students preparing for exams complained of exhaustion, and those who worked long shifts simply couldn't function anymore. Rest became a luxury that nobody on that block could afford. The source of the problem, however, was not the dog. It was Karen. She was the kind of neighbor who thrived on ignoring rules, pretending that any inconvenience she caused was someone else's fault. Her front yard was overgrown with weeds, her trash bins sat on the curb days after pickup, and she often left her Christmas lights up well into spring. Now, with her dog's endless barking, she had pushed her negligence to new heights. People tried to handle it politely at first. Notes were slipped into her mail box, folded neatly with words that begged for understanding. Some even attempted face-to-face conversations, hoping to reason with her. But Karen brushed it all aside. To her, the neighbors were simply being dramatic. She insisted the dog had a right to bark, that it was natural, and that if anyone had a problem with it, they should simply get better windows. This attitude ignited a spark of resentment. What had once been mild annoyance grew into outright hostility. Conversations in driveways and whispers across fences began to center on Karen and her oblivious defiance. The neighborhood, once a peaceful collection of families who waved hello in the mornings, had found a common enemy. The nights dragged on. The barking continued. And with every sleepless hour, tensions climbed. Children arrived at school yawning, unable to focus. Workers stumbled into offices with bags under their eyes. Elderly residents complained about their health being affected. What was once a comfortable community had become a place of frustration, all thanks to Karen's refusal to acknowledge reality. One evening, when the dog's barks shattered yet another midnight silence, a breaking point was reached. Neighbors texted each other in frustration, their group chat lighting up with complaints, gifs of barking dogs, and angry rants. It was in that chat that the first seeds of collective action were planted. What if, they asked each other, they didn't just suffer in silence? What if they made Karen see the damage she was causing? But for now, all they had was fury and exhaustion. Everyone knew the coming days would bring confrontation. The community wasn't going to let this slide any longer. The block had changed. It was no longer just a neighborhood with houses and families. It was a battlefield, with sleepless residents on one side and Karen's relentless barking dog on the other. And though Karen had ignored the warning signs, she was about to learn that an entire block united against her was far louder than her dog could ever be. As the sun rose after yet another sleepless night, tired faces peered from windows, coffee cups clutched tightly in weary hands. Everyone wondered the same thing. How much longer could they endure this before something snapped? And in that silence between barks, a plan was beginning to take shape. The neighborhood had reached its breaking point. What began as scattered complaints had now become a shared misery, a nightly torment that united the block in anger. Every evening, the same ritual repeated itself. Karen's dog started barking as the sun dipped, and by midnight, the noise rose to a crescendo that no one could escape. The group chat, once reserved for friendly reminders about yard sales and community picnics, had transformed into a support group for the sleepless. Screens lit up late into the night with messages from frustrated residents. Parents vented about their children being cranky and unfocused at school. Night shift workers shared stories of returning home exhausted, only to be kept awake by the relentless barking. Elderly neighbors spoke of their health declining from constant stress. The more people shared their suffering, the more determined they became. A consensus formed. Something had to be done. The first attempt at organized resistance came in the form of a formal complaint. One neighbor, a retired teacher named Mrs. Green, drafted a carefully worded letter addressed to Karen. It outlined the impact the barking was having, emphasized the need for community cooperation, and ended with a polite but firm request for her to take responsibility. The letter was signed by more than half the residents on the block and slipped into Karen's mailbox one afternoon. But Karen was not the type to respond with humility. She read the letter, crumpled it in her hand, and tossed it straight into her overflowing trash bin. Later that evening, she bragged to a friend on her porch, loud enough for nearby neighbors to hear, that the neighborhood was full of whiners and she would not be bullied into controlling her dog. That act of defiance spread quickly. Word of Karen's dismissal traveled through text messages, hushed conversations on sidewalks, and subtle nods exchanged across driveways. By treating the united voices of her neighbors with disdain, Karen had escalated the conflict to an entirely new level. The following week, the barking continued unabated. Karen's dog, restless and territorial, barked at cars passing by, at cats slinking under fences, and sometimes at nothing at all. Every sound was a trigger, and as the nights wore on, the collective exhaustion gave way to bitterness. Some residents began to retaliate in small, almost petty ways. A neighbor who usually kept his porch light off began leaving it on all night, shining directly toward Karen's yard. Another neighbor started mowing his lawn at sunrise on weekends, knowing Karen liked to sleep late. These small acts were not coordinated, but they marked the first sparks of resistance. The neighborhood was no longer silently enduring, it was beginning to push back. Then came the first official intervention. A couple down the street filed a noise complaint with the city. Officers arrived one evening, standing outside Karen's property to confirm the constant barking. They knocked on her door, and for a moment, the block watched from behind curtains with a collective breath held in hope. Perhaps this would finally put an end to it. But once again, Karen refused accountability. She argued with the officers, insisting her dog was a guard dog, and that barking was proof the animal was doing its job. She dismissed their warnings with arrogance, and though the officers left her with a citation, she wore it like a badge of honor. By the very next night, the barking was as bad as ever. This blatant disregard only fueled the neighborhood's anger. The group chat exploded with outrage. The citation had given them hope, and Karen's defiance crushed it. The frustration had boiled over into determination. That was when the idea of true collective action emerged. A neighbor suggested a meeting, a real gathering of the block to discuss strategies. It was a bold move, one that signaled the residents were no longer treating this as an annoyance, but as a full-scale problem that demanded resolution. The meeting was held in the backyard of the Johnsons, a family who lived directly across from Karen. Folding chairs were arranged in a circle under the glow of string lights. Parents brought restless children who dozed on blankets. Elderly residents arrived bundled in sweaters, and nearly every household was represented. The dogs' barking echoed in the background, a constant reminder of why they had gathered. The discussion was heated, voices layered with exhaustion and anger. Some pushed for more legal action, citing noise ordinances and HOA bylaws. Others suggested creative tactics, ways to make Karen feel the same level of disruption she had inflicted on them. Ideas flew around the circle, some practical, others outrageous. But what mattered most was that the block was no longer fragmented. They were united, a single force determined to protect their right to peace. That night, as the neighbors returned to their homes, there was a shift in the air. The frustration that had once weighed them down was now channeled into purpose. They had a mission. They had a plan. And whether Karen realized it or not, the block had declared war. The dog barked on, oblivious to the storm it had unleashed. But in the silence between the howls, something stronger than annoyance had taken root. Resolve. Karen had ignored every warning, dismissed every complaint, and laughed at every attempt to reason with her. Now she had the entire block against her. And as the first hints of dawn touched the rooftops, the neighborhood knew this fight was just beginning. The neighborhood had tried patience. They had tried civility. They had even tried the law. And yet Karen's dog barked on, night after night, as if mocking every effort to silence it. But after the late-night backyard meeting, a new energy rippled through the community. What had once been a collection of weary, frustrated families had transformed into a determined alliance. The first wave of retaliation was subtle, almost invisible if you weren't paying attention. Porch lights glared through the night, angling toward Karen's yard, bathing her house in an artificial daylight that made it impossible for her to rest easily. Motion sensor sprinklers were adjusted so that any movement near her fence, including her restless dog, would trigger a burst of water. Neighbors began trimming their lawns and running noisy leaf blowers earlier in the morning than ever before. Small inconveniences, yes, but enough to chip away at Karen's sense of superiority. Still, the dog barked. Karen, of course, wore her stubbornness like armor. She strutted around the block during the day with the same smug look, waving off the glares and whispers of her neighbors. She claimed the community was simply jealous of her independence, that they couldn't stand someone who didn't bow to their rules. But beneath that bravado, cracks were beginning to form. The sleeplessness that plagued the neighborhood was starting to reach her too, because even Karen could not escape her dog's relentless noise. By the second week of organized resistance, the neighborhood had escalated their tactics. The group chat buzzed with coordination. If Karen's dog barked through the night, then the block would make sure Karen didn't enjoy her mornings. Neighbors revved engines a little longer before leaving for work. Lawnmowers started at sunrise. A group of kids, normally scolded for being too loud, were encouraged to play ball on the sidewalk right outside Karen's house. The sound of laughter, once a target of her complaints, now became a weapon aimed directly at her. The effect was immediate. Karen was visibly more irritable. She snapped at delivery drivers. She yelled at children. She even shouted at her own dog, though her outbursts only made it bark louder. For the first time, the community sensed a shift in the balance of power. The woman who once dismissed them as powerless complainers was finally feeling the pressure. But retaliation alone was not enough. The neighbors wanted something permanent, something that would force Karen to take responsibility. That's when the idea of collective complaints gained traction. It wasn't enough for one or two people to file noise reports. If the entire block submitted formal grievances, backed by logs of barking hours, audio recordings, and statements of sleepless nights, the authorities would have no choice but to act. So they organized. Residents kept detailed journals noting each night's disturbances with timestamps. Parents recorded videos of their crying children woken by the barking. Elderly neighbors documented blood pressure spikes and health issues linked to the constant stress. Bit by bit, the community was building an undeniable case, a mountain of evidence too large for Karen to ignore. And yet, even as this plan unfolded, the dog continued its nightly chorus. The sound dug into every corner of the block, scraping away at patience and sanity. Some nights were worse than others, with hours of uninterrupted barking that felt like torture. Neighbors messaged each other at 2, 3, and 4 in the morning, sharing their misery in real time. But those sleepless chats also served another purpose. They reminded everyone they weren't alone. It was during one particularly long night that the idea of a protest was born. If Karen wanted to ignore private complaints, then the community would go public. The plan was bold, a coordinated demonstration right in front of her house. Neighbors would gather with signs, posters, and megaphones, not just to make their point to Karen, but to ensure the entire town saw it. Preparation began quietly. Supplies were gathered, slogans were written, and schedules were coordinated. The date was chosen carefully, on a Saturday morning when most people were home and the street was busiest. By then, the community's evidence logs would already be submitted to the HOA and city officials, ensuring that the protest wasn't just noise, but part of a larger campaign. Karen, of course, remained oblivious. She dismissed the earlier acts of resistance as petty harassment, never realizing the block was uniting into something far greater than she imagined. She believed she could outlast her neighbors' frustration, that eventually they would give up and return to their routines. But what she didn't understand was that she had already created something stronger than annoyance. She had forged solidarity. The night before the protest, the dog barked as usual, echoing into the early hours. But this time, the noise wasn't met with hopeless sighs. It was met with anticipation. The neighbors lay awake, exhausted but resolute, knowing the next day would mark the turning point. And as dawn broke, the block prepared itself for battle. Signs were painted with bold letters. Let us sleep. Control your dog. Respect the community. Megaphones were tested. Coffee was brewed in bulk. Families gathered, children clutching posters almost as tall as they were. The air buzzed with nervous excitement. Karen had no idea what was waiting for her when she opened her blinds that morning. But the block was ready. They were no longer victims of her negligence. They were an army. And they were about to show her what happened when an entire neighborhood fought back. The Saturday morning sun rose over the block, but instead of the usual calm of weekend routines, the air was alive with energy. The neighborhood had prepared for this moment meticulously, and today they were ready to confront Karen directly. By 9 o'clock, the street outside Karen's house looked nothing like the quiet suburban lane it once was. Neighbors stood shoulder to shoulder, holding signs with bold words scrawled across them. Let us sleep. Respect the neighborhood. Control your dog. Children waved posters nearly as tall as themselves, while parents gripped coffee mugs with determination. Elderly residents, normally quiet and reserved, sat in lawn chairs positioned prominently on the sidewalk, their presence a symbol of the toll Karen's dog had taken on their fragile health. The first sounds of chanting rose, hesitant at first but growing louder with each repetition. Let us sleep! Let us sleep! The rhythm spread down the block, echoing off houses, carrying far beyond the street. Megaphones crackled to life as neighbors took turns voicing their frustrations, not with anger, but with conviction. They weren't here to be petty. They were here to demand peace. Karen had no warning. She was still in her pajamas when she yanked open her blinds to see a crowd assembled outside her home. For the first time in months, the neighborhood wasn't whispering about her behind fences or complaining in group chats. They were standing directly at her doorstep. Her smugness evaporated. She stormed out onto her porch, the barking dog trailing behind her, as if sensing the chaos. The neighbors paused for a moment, eyes fixed on her, but then the chants resumed, louder than before. Karen tried to shout over them, her arms waving wildly, but her voice was swallowed by the collective power of dozens of tired, fed-up residents. The dog barked furiously, worked up by the noise and commotion. Its deep howls added to the cacophony, but for once, the barking wasn't dominating the night. It was drowned out by the ices of the neighborhood. The very weapon Karen had ignored had now turned into background noise against the roar of collective unity. Word of the protest spread quickly. Curious passers-by stopped to watch. Cars slowed as drivers rolled down their windows, taking in the spectacle of a suburban revolt. Some even honked in solidarity, amused at the sight of an entire community rising up against one entitled neighbor. What had started as a simple act of defiance was rapidly becoming a public spectacle. Karen, red-faced and sputtering with rage, screamed about harassment, about her rights, about how the neighborhood was out to get her. But each time she shouted, the chants only grew louder. The neighbors had reached the point where they no longer cared about her accusations. They knew the truth, and now the world could see it too. It didn't take long for officials to arrive. A city noise enforcement officer showed up first, clipboard in hand, followed by a police cruiser to keep the peace. The crowd parted respectfully, but the chanting didn't stop. Residents stepped forward one by one, presenting their logs of sleepless nights, their audio recordings, their videos of children crying and families awake at 2 a.m. The officer listened carefully, jotting down notes, his face tightening as the weight of the evidence became clear. Karen tried to argue, her voice shrill and unrelenting, but it was different now. For months, her neighbors had been isolated in their suffering, easy for her to dismiss. But here, standing united with evidence in hand, the community's voice was impossible to ignore. The officer warned Karen in no uncertain terms. The citations would escalate, fines would mount, and if she failed to control her dog, more serious legal consequences would follow. The crowd erupted in cheers, not out of cruelty, but relief. Finally, after endless night, of barking, they were being heard. But the protest didn't end there. The neighbors remained, continuing their chants, ensuring Karen understood the depth of their frustration. News of the demonstration had already reached local reporters. A small news van pulled up, camera crew stepping out, eager to capture the spectacle of a suburban uprising. Microphones were thrust into hands, and residents gave interviews, detailing months of sleepless nights and the toll it had taken on their lives. Karen, meanwhile, retreated into her house, slamming the door behind her. From the windows, she glared at the crowd, her face twisted with fury and humiliation. The dog barked from inside, its muffled sounds barely audible over the chanting outside. For once, the neighborhood was louder than the problem. As the day stretched on, the crowd slowly began to disperse, satisfied that their message had been delivered. Signs were collected, megaphones turned off, but the unity lingered. Neighbors who had barely spoken before now laughed together, shook hands, and shared stories. What Karen had intended as her right to disrupt had, ironically, strengthened the bonds between the people she had alienated. By the evening, the block was quieter than it had been in months. The dog barked occasionally, but not with the same relentless energy. Perhaps it was exhausted from the day's chaos. Or perhaps even it sensed that something had changed. Karen had been humiliated, confronted not by 1 or 2 complainers, but by the entire block united against her. The protest had shown her that she couldn't hide behind excuses anymore. The world had seen, the authorities had warned her, and her neighbors had found their strength. But as the sun dipped below the horizon and porch lights flickered on, the residents knew the battle wasn't over. Karen wasn't the type to give up quietly. She would push back, find ways to retaliate, and cling to her pride no matter the cost. The question now was simple. How far would she go? And how far was the neighborhood willing to push back in return? The block had taken its stand, but the war with Karen was far from finished. The protest had shaken Karen in ways she didn't expect. For months, she had dismissed her neighbors as weak complainers who lacked the courage to confront her directly. But seeing the entire block standing on her lawn, holding signs, chanting, and even attracting news cameras, had pierced the armor of her arrogance. Still, Karen wasn't the type to accept defeat gracefully. Humiliation festered inside her like a wound, and in her mind, the neighborhood hadn't simply protested. They had declared war. And if there was one thing Karen loved more than being right, it was fighting back, no matter how irrational the battle. The retaliation began quietly, disguised as coincidence. One morning, Several neighbors found their trash bins tipped over, garbage strewn across the sidewalks. At first, it seemed like a mischievous act by animals or perhaps teenagers, but the pattern was too precise. Only the homes of those most vocal in the protest were targeted. Karen's bins, of course, remained untouched, standing neatly upright. Next came the anonymous complaints. A handful of residents received letters from the HOA, citing supposed violations ranging from improper lawn maintenance to excessive street parking. It didn't take long to realize who was behind it. Karen had filed reports, trying to turn the very system the neighborhood hoped would hold her accountable into a weapon against them. But if Karen thought her tactics would break the community's spirit, she was mistaken. Instead of splintering, the block grew tighter. Neighbors compared notes, shared the letters they received, and quickly exposed Karen's role. What might have once caused division now became another reason to unite against her. Frustrated by the failure of her covert moves, Karen grew bolder. She began shouting insults over her fence, loud enough for everyone to hear. She accused her neighbors of harassment, of being a cult, even of plotting to steal her property. She stood in her yard with her phone, recording passers-by, trying to intimidate them with the threat of fabricated evidence. Her dog, still restless, barked alongside her, its voice blending with her own tirades. But whereas the barking had once dominated the block, it was now overshadowed by Karen's own theatrics. The dog had become less of a nuisance and more of a symbol, a reflection of its owner's refusal to be controlled. The neighborhood, however, had grown resilient. The protest had given them a taste of power, and they weren't about to hand it back. Instead of engaging Karen directly, they documented everything. Every tipped trash bin, every baseless HOA complaint, every shouted insult was logged and shared in the group chat. A paper trail was forming, one that would prove beyond doubt that Karen was the aggressor, not the victim. Karen's desperation escalated further when she decided to weaponize her dog outright. On several occasions, she deliberately let it out into the yard late at night, knowing full well it would bark for hours. She smirked as porch lights flicked on and curtains twitched, certain she was reclaiming her dominance. But she underestimated the neighborhood's patience for her games. The residents had already filed their collective noise complaint with the city, and now, with fresh evidence piling up, the case against her grew ironclad. Multiple recordings captured not only the dog's endless barking, but also Karen's own voice egging it on. The tipping point came when Karen, in a fit of rage, called the police on her neighbors. She claimed they were harassing her, staging illegal gatherings, and threatening her safety. When officers arrived, however, they were met not with a hostile mob, but with calm, organized residents ready to present their side. They produced logs, videos, and records of complaints, showing a pattern of behavior that left the officers with little doubt about who the true aggressor was. Karen's attempt to flip the narrative collapsed. The officers warned her, in clear terms, that filing false reports would not only fail to help her case, but could result in legal consequences of its own. For the first time, Karen found herself on the defensive, her once unshakable confidence visibly cracking. The neighborhood sensed it. The tide had turned. No longer were they the victims of her dog or her arrogance. Now, Karen was the one under scrutiny. Every move she made recorded, every outburst logged. The more she lashed out, the deeper the hole she dug for herself. Yet Karen couldn't stop. Pride kept her fighting long after common sense should have told her to surrender. She doubled down on her defiance, convinced that if she just held out long enough, the neighborhood would tire and return to silence. But the neighborhood wasn't tired anymore. They were energized, fueled by the progress they had made and the bonds they had formed. What Karen saw as a war, the residents saw as justice, and they had no intention of backing down. The block had weathered months of sleepless nights, endured her retaliation, and now stood stronger than ever. They had turned their frustration into action, their exhaustion into solidarity, and while Karen clung to her pride, The walls around her were closing in. The next move, the neighbors knew, would not be theirs. It would come from the authorities. The evidence was too overwhelming, the complaints too numerous, the attention too public. The question wasn't if Karen would face consequences anymore. The question was when. And as the neighborhood settled into another restless night, their patience no longer carried the weight of despair. Instead, it carried the quiet confidence of people who knew justice was finally on their side. The dog barked on, but its cries no longer. Anger commanded the same power. They were the fading echoes of a battle Karen had already lost. She just didn't know it yet. The block had endured months of sleepless nights, endless barking, and Karen's defiance. They had protested, documented, and resisted. They had suffered her retaliation and outlasted her fury. By now, the entire neighborhood knew the battle was entering its final stage. The evidence was overwhelming. The authorities were watching closely, and Karen's own arrogance had left her with nowhere to run. It began with letters, official notices delivered by the city. They weren't the polite warnings she had scoffed at before. These were citations backed by the weight of repeated violations, each one accompanied by escalating fines. The neighbors watched from their porches as Karen tore open the envelopes, her face flushing with anger as she read the words inside. She shouted at the mail carrier, cursed the city officials, and stormed inside her house. But no tantrum could change the truth. The law had finally caught up to her. Karen refused to pay the fines at first. She claimed they were unfair, that she was the victim of a conspiracy. But the penalties grew steeper with every missed deadline, compounding into thousands of dollars. The city wasn't bluffing, and neither was the HOA. Together, they launched a formal investigation into her behavior, armed with the mountain of evidence provided by her neighbors. The dog's barking, once dismissed as a nuisance, was now categorized as a chronic violation of noise ordinances. Karen's deliberate negligence, her refusal to address the issue, and her retaliatory behavior against the community had created a paper trail of non-compliance. The authorities had more than enough to act, and this time, Karen's stubbornness was her undoing. The breaking point came one late night when the barking reached its usual fever pitch. Several neighbors, already in contact with the city, reported it simultaneously. Within an hour, Animal Control Office, cars arrived, their vehicle pulling up quietly under the glow of streetlights. The neighborhood watched from behind curtains and cracked doors as officers approached Karen's yard. The dog barked furiously, its voice carrying through the night, but this time it wasn't ignored. After a tense confrontation, the decision was made. The dog, neglected and left outside for hours without proper training or care, was taken into custody. The sight of the animal control officers leading the dog away left the block stunned. For months, the barking had been their torment, their nightly prison. And now, in one decisive moment, the noise was silenced. Karen erupted in rage, screaming into the night as the officers loaded the dog into their vehicle. She shouted about rights, about property, about conspiracies and betrayal. But her words fell flat. The neighborhood didn't respond with jeers or applause. They simply stood in silence, listening to the one thing they hadn't heard in months: peace. The removal of the dog was only the beginning. The mounting fines, the citations, and the complaints had left Karen in a financial and legal corner. The HOA, armed with bylaws she had long ignored, pursued enforcement measures that included liens against her property. The city, tired of her defiance, issued strict probationary conditions. She was ordered to comply with noise ordinances, to clean up her property, and to cease harassing her neighbors, or face far steeper consequences. Karen tried to fight. She filed appeals, sent angry letters, and even attempted to rally sympathy online. But her efforts backfired spectacularly. Videos of the neighborhood protest had spread beyond the block, circulating on local news and social media. Strangers mocked her arrogance, commentators ridiculed her defiance, and even her attempts at self-defense were drowned out by the overwhelming evidence of her behavior. Isolated, humiliated, and drowning in legal trouble, Karen's reign over the block was finally broken. Where once she had strutted through the neighborhood with smug superiority, she now skulked indoors, curtains drawn tight, avoiding the very people she had tormented. The dog was gone, the fines were piling, and the once untouchable neighbor had been reduced to a cautionary tale. For the block, the transformation was immediate. Nights were quiet again. Families slept soundly for the first time in months. Children woke up refreshed, parents smiled more easily, and the elderly residents who had once complained of declining health now found themselves regaining strength. The street, once divided by tension and exhaustion, was alive with laughter and camaraderie. Neighbors who had barely exchanged greetings before now shared barbecues, block parties, and casual chats across fences. They had been forged in fire, united by sleepless nights and collective action. And though none of them would have chosen the ordeal, they all recognized what they had gained, a sense of community stronger than they'd ever known. As for Karen, her story faded into whispers. Some said she eventually moved away, unable to bear the humiliation of her defeat. Others claimed she stayed, but remained bitter and reclusive, a shadow of her former self. Whatever the truth, it no longer mattered. She had lost the war she started, and the neighborhood had won. The block returned to peace, not because of one person's action, but because of the collective strength of many. It was a lesson written into the very fabric of their street. No one, not even the loudest Karen, could stand against a united community. And so the nights became quiet again. The stars shone undisturbed, the air filled not with barks or shouts, but with the simple, cherished sound of silence. The neighborhood had fought back, and in the end they had reclaimed their peace,